This will be Michael Akresh is going to present this. Michael's Department of Environmental Studies at Antioch University, the New England campus in Keene, New Hampshire. He's got multiple authors. I refer, here they are, but I'm going to give you the name of the talk so he can get moving. Hurricane-Induced Fluctuations in a Critically Endangered Population of West Indian Woodpeckers Over 2 Decades. Michael, it's yours.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Joe, and thanks for organizing the symposium. Everybody can hear me and see me okay, see the slides. I'll take that as a yes. I'll be presenting about hurricanes and woodpeckers on San Salvador Island in the Bahamas in collaboration with a number of other people, including Bill Hayes and Bob Askins. And so to introduce, as we've heard throughout the symposium, hurricanes can have large impacts on bird populations. This includes birds on small islands, as well as threatened and at-risk populations, such as the Bahama nuthatch, which hasn't been seen to my knowledge since Hurricane Dorian in 2019. And also going to have big impacts on food resources, such as fruit and nectar, and that affects frugivores and nectarivores. Many short-term studies have been published on the effects of hurricanes, and generally few long-term studies have been published. However, hopefully more to come, given all the great talks in this symposium. So we focused on the West Indian woodpecker. There's a subspecies of this woodpecker that's found only on San Salvador Island in the Bahamas. And this woodpecker has previously thought to be gone extinct in the last 100 years or so, yet to be found again over and over throughout the last 100 years. And so we monitored the population and examined the effects of hurricanes over a period of 20 years. For those that might not know, San Salvador Island is one of the easternmost islands in the Bahamas. It is located about 100 miles east of Nassau, and we first did surveys throughout the island to try to locate where the population of woodpeckers was. We focused on areas that were accessible on roads and trails, as well as Bill Hayes did a number of surveys by boat along the inland lakes. And we found the main population in the northern part of the island, as past studies have found, due to suitable habitat there, such as sable palm snags that they nest in, as well as taller coppice. So in that in that main population area, over time we did repeated surveys. This included point count surveys on transects in 96 and 98. And then about a decade later, did some playback surveys, 2004 to 2006, and then did more surveys this past decade. And so we would play this call and try to see if there's any birds playing back and calling back or coming into the woodpecker. Along those surveys, during that time period, there was also a number of hurricanes. So 4 major hurricanes passed over the island during our surveys. This included Hurricane Bertha and Lily in 1996, Hurricane Francis in 2004, and Hurricane Joaquin in 2015. And so we analyzed our data using mixed models and also accounted for the type of survey and observer. So looking at our results, this actually just got published, this study today, which is really good timing in Bird Conservation International. So you can go and check it out in the early online view. So for this figure, on the y-axis, you have density, the number of territories per 10 hectares. And then on the x-axis is a categorical variable of hurricane. So we classified it as 1 year post-hurricane, 2 to 3 years post-hurricane, and then also pre-hurricane is anything after 4 years or greater. And as you can see, the birds had a baseline level pre-hurricane and then declined 1 year post-hurricane, and then seemed to bounce back up 2 to 3 years post-hurricane. So looking a little bit more closely at the surveys among the years, Here on the x-axis now you have year, and also WS is wet season and DS is dry season. And the red symbols indicate the hurricanes. In 96, the population was at a baseline level. We didn't actually survey in 97, but the population seemed to be doing well in 98. We then surveyed again in 2004, when in the fall a hurricane hit, and then 2005 we had lower densities, and then the population bounced back up in 2006. And then in the 2010s, we had a number of surveys that were baseline. The population seemed to decline after Hurricane Joaquin in 2016. And then 2018, we did see a slight increase in the population numbers. This may have been also due to survey effort, why the population didn't fully come back up in 2018. And so I'm showing you another figure here. This is the same figure, but just formatted slightly differently. But now it also includes surveys from 2020. So I went back to the island in March 2020 and found that regardless of how the population was doing in 2018, the population is definitely back at its baseline levels, at least this year so far. We also looked at model estimated population size, looking at the area that the birds were using, as well as multiplying that by the bird density. And we found that the population normally is about at 120 pairs. And this is an estimation. But 1 year post-hurricane, the population really declines quite a bit, down to about 40 pairs, and this is a 65% loss of the population following a hurricane. And so we believe that lower densities are likely due to mortality after the hurricane. Approximately half of the diet of West Indian woodpeckers is fruit. So perhaps they're dying after the hurricane due to lack of food, especially fruit resources and freshwater resources. San Salvador and other islands in the Bahamas are fairly low-lying, and saltwater intrusion is often a problem. San Salvador is only about 6 kilometers by 12 or 13 kilometers. So these birds couldn't really disperse to undisturbed habitat. A lot of the island, most of the island got hit pretty hard after the hurricanes, and these couldn't disperse, such as larger islands, such as in Puerto Rico or elsewhere. Talking about some of the main themes in the symposium, these birds did seem to have resilience. The population rebounded after hurricanes. Perhaps this was due to high productivity in the year after a hurricane. These birds can double brood, and they also produce about 5 to 6 young per clutch. And interestingly, they also nest in sable palm snags. And as a previous presenter showed, that palms do stay standing after a hurricane. So perhaps this allowed for high productivity after the hurricane. Resistance, smaller storms potentially had less impact on the birds. We really focused on storms that could really impact the vegetation, but perhaps smaller storms have less impact on these birds. And in terms of legacy effects, it's interesting to think about. More research is needed. This is a small population, and if the birds continually have decreases in their population size, perhaps there's genetic bottlenecks, and inbreeding depression is something to look at in the future. So climate change, as we've heard, may be increasing hurricane intensities due to sea level warming. And this is especially problematic for small populations like the West Indian woodpeckers and other small island populations, because they're especially vulnerable. In the past, perhaps West Indian woodpeckers were found elsewhere on the island, but currently their habitat is really reduced to the northern part of the island. And so thinking more about how hurricanes interact with existing threats and how they can impact these populations is really something to consider, such as invasive species or habitat loss, and how the effects of hurricanes interact with those other threats. is really something to think about in the future. Hurricanes that occur year after year, such as increased frequency, or really intense hurricanes like Hurricane Dorian, could be really devastating for populations in the future. So I want to thank the GRC for logistics help on San Salvador, many of our funders, including the U.S. Forest Service, Antioch University, and Connecticut College, Walt Disney Foundation, and other funders, and many, many field technicians that helped out over the years with this study. Thanks, and hopefully there's time for some questions.
Thanks, Mike. That was a nice presentation, and indeed there is some time for questions or comments. I'm looking for some to pop in here. A question on the palms. How frugivorous are the West Indian woodpeckers? Are they comparable to red-bellied woodpeckers?
Yeah, past studies, at least in Cuba, found that they, and perhaps elsewhere, they are about 50%, and then the other 50% is probably insects or perhaps some small vertebrates like lizards. We didn't study their diet on San Salvador particularly, but perhaps that's enough that if half of their food resources are gone following a hurricane, that could then affect them.
Well, your point on palms and their resistance has also been pointed out by the plant ecologists that palms in general are remarkably resistant, and that may play a major role, as you mentioned, where they're nesting, but also as occasional food resources and the ability for those palms to recover. So the issue of palms and their resistance and resilience, I think for some species of birds in the Caribbean is very, very important. And they also seem to be remarkably salt tolerant. And one of the things on those Bahamian Islands versus the Greater Antilles and even the Lesser Antilles is that there seems to be a lot, depending on the storm, a lot of mortality of plants due to salt spray. And I never appreciated that, working primarily in the Lower Caribbean until I came up to the Bahamas on those small low-lying islands. Salt spray and salt damage can be a major factor. So a couple of questions have come in, so don't let me
Yeah, definitely. I think salt intrusion, as we saw in Grand Bahama as well, is a big factor. That is something to consider.
go ahead.
So yeah, Cindy Stacy here had a question earlier about how different response between migratory and resident species. I think something interesting is that migratory species, they can kind of go back and breed on the breeding grounds the following year. So there are Kirtland's warblers on the island, and they may have gotten hit by the hurricane, but a lot of the migratory species are insectivores. So they often can be okay after a hurricane in terms of food resources. And they can breed, go back to such as North America or black whiskered vireo going south. They might be able to breed elsewhere and then come back in higher numbers the following year. So the resident species, I think, are really ones that might be really hit hard by hurricanes in the Caribbean.
Here's another question for you. Do you have data on other species as well, such as nectivores on the island?
We do have a lot of misnetting data, although most of that was before Hurricane Joaquin. I don't have any misnetting data after the hurricane. There has been some studies by Michael Murphy previously, I think Murphy et al. 98, that actually showed that banana quits do decline on San Salvador after hurricanes. So similar to other species, we would probably, similar to other studies, we'd probably find effects on the frugivores and other species that eat fruit and nectar.
Okay.
I think that's it for my time.
Yeah.
Unless,
We still have 5 minutes or so, and I'd like to go back to some other unanswered questions, or if if people, excuse me, have some comments, we've got the time. So certainly would encourage follow up, because I know there were some questions here that we weren't able to. There's a question here for Ethan, if he's still tuned in, and that how often have hurricanes of this magnitude, I guess referring to Maria, affected Dominica in the weather records?
Yeah, my knowledge of it is the last major one was David in 1980. And I'm not sure about things that have happened more frequently than that. So I don't really know the long-term history of hurricanes on Dominica. What I would say is, based upon what I've heard yesterday, we may expect hurricanes more frequently and at higher intensity. And so I think that it's likely that the island may experience more hurricanes in the future and more intense ones. That's not the best answer, but that's about all I can do. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just skimming these questions here. Actually, a question for any or all is, and Maria Uriarte pointed it out in her talk, that of the climate models, and they that have looked at hurricane frequency and increases in the most frequent storms, the most robust models predict more rainfall. And I wonder if any folks here want to comment on wet storms versus dry storms, because I've been through enough of them now to know the difference. And Maria was a very, very wet storm. Hugo was a remarkably dry storm. In fact, after Hugo, in Puerto Rico, Luquillo Mountains, the rivers were still clear. They weren't muddy at all, yet it was a tremendously damaging storm. And then following Hugo, there was a major drought. Not the same with Maria or Irma. So these are going to obviously affect, well, certainly resilience. Anybody have observations that wish to comment on that issue? Don't be shy.
Joe, if I could just add something to that based upon my 2 years of work in Dominica. As I noted, Maria removed the rainforest canopy. And when I got to Dominica 7 months after the hurricane, residents were talking to me about the heat because the canopy was no longer there. And I would say that one of the effects I observed in at least one lowland population of Heliconia carabea was very, very poor seed set, not just because of lack of pollinator visits, but because it was so hot and dry as a result. And I think that we have to pay attention to the consequences after removal of a canopy and the fact that it can actually make rainforest and elfin forest habitat much